Well, I know it feels really slow moving through this, but it's so important to try to relate to this. So I apologize for my slow pace. So net filtration pressure. So in the end, how much force is there pushing fluid into the capsule and therefore through the renal tubule and allowing the kidney to do its job, right? Because if you have no filtration pressure, then nothing's entering the kidney and your blood is not going to be changed, and that's a problem because all these cells are just continuously producing toxic waste and using things from the blood and dumping things in the blood is really going to lead to serious problems systemically. So net filtration pressure, this force to push things again ultimately into the nephron, would be figured from the force favoring filtration, right? Glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure, which is really related directly to your blood pressure. And this difference in the opposing, so the stuff that's trying to keep fluids in the blood. So this is pushing it out, this is keeping it in. So typically this one wins, and typically this is the one that changes, right? The osmotic pressure is fairly constant. There are pathologies that changes, but really on a moment-to-moment basis, this is pretty constant. Capsular hydrostatic pressure can fluctuate a little bit, but really, again, as long as there's not a blockage in the nephron, you're probably going to have a fairly constant amount of volume in that capsule. It won't decrease or increase, and so you will not oppose, you won't change the opposition. It's really this that changes. So I say here, minor blood pressure changes. So again, systemic blood pressure, your mean arterial blood pressure, or the osmolarity of the fluids, right, which is concentration of fluids. All right, so minor changes in blood pressure or the concentration of fluids have a major change in the amount of filtrate formed. All right, so and again here, amount of filtrate formed is going to dictate the amount of urine, because remember that you're going to reclaim 99%, but 1% is going to leave every time fluid moves through that nephron. So if you increase your filtrate formed, and this would be done by increasing filtration pressure, all right, you are going to start to lose more fluids and more stuff in it. So this is bad. That's why I said your filtration rate is really important, and that is absolutely dependent on your filtration pressure. So and if you form it too slow, then you have a problem as well. Then you're not getting rid of stuff that you need to, and you're not cleaning the blood like you should. So you really need a fairly constant glomerular filtration rate, and the glomerular filtration rate is directly related to this pressure, because that pressure is pushing it out. And so the glomerular filtration rate is, well, how quickly does it form, right? So we typically want this to stay somewhere around 125 milliliters per minute. And it is acceptable to go a little bit higher and a little bit lower, but not, the range is really tight for this. So autoregulation is the ability of the kidney, right? I call it self-rule. The kidneys can keep your filtration rate constant even when your systemic blood pressure rises. So this is your mean arterial blood pressure. And it does this because it can control the efferent and afferent vessels, right? And this is due to that juxtaglomerular apparatus we talked about in the previous video. So you can, two arterioles with this glomerulus between it, right? So I said, think of it as a faucet and a drain. And the diameters of these tubes, these arterioles, can be altered, and altered pretty precisely because they're surrounded by this smooth muscle. All right, I say normally net filtration pressure is positive, and good news, yes, right, you've got a force, so this one is winning, and more fluid, right, is being pushed, and therefore we are actually cleaning up the blood. And I say here again, hydrostatic pressure is the most likely to change. Right? And it does stay higher than normal capillaries, again, because of these arterioles. Right? So I say here, again, consequences. If the kidney fails to excrete urine, right, which, again, is a waste product, you have all this toxic waste that's staying in the body. So your glomerular filtration rate is an indicator of how well your kidneys are working. The typical word for this is the renal clearance. So That's the rate, the specific rate, the actual number at how quickly a certain chemical or molecule is removed from plasma. And it is an indicator of how well this whole system is working. And when it isn't working so well, it helps us track how quickly the disease is getting, how the seriousness of the disease or progression of the disease. All right? So we use just a few different substances which are basically not reabsorbed or secreted. So they're basically inulin and para-aminohippuric acid are two molecules that could be used, and they would be infused into the blood, and when the blood passes through the kidneys, they would leave the blood and enter into the nephron, and they would not return. So then all we do is we collect urine and measure how quickly these things, right, the amount that we gave the person shows up in the urine, right? And they help us calculate glomerular filtration rate and plasma flow through the kidneys. So again, I'm not going to ask you about renal clearance on a test, but this is again to demonstrate this, how important this concept is. This is really telling us, glomerular filtration rate is telling us how well the kidneys are working. All right, so this rate then drives fluid in, and we want to give the cells along here a chance to reabsorb, right? Which means we're returning. And I said 99% of the filtrate is going to be returned. So this lovely little cartoon shows you the different regions of the renal tubule and says, okay, here's the things that we really bring back. So lots of stuff, as I've already mentioned, comes back in the proximal convoluted tubule, and it comes back right away because we want it back in the body. It's needed, right? These things are needed. Vitamins, lactate, right? Urea, uric acid. These are waste products, but they are needed in the kidney, so we can accept that, right? Sodium, potassium, calcium, you name it, right? And water. Water always follows, right, because of osmosis, these in the proximal convoluted tubule. We have things that can be secreted. So that's what we have, these different colors here. So if it's being reabsorbed, it's a lighter purple, and secreted, it's this kind of yellowish. So urea, uric acid, yes, these guys get recycled a lot here, and there's reasons for this, but creatinine and some drugs, hydrogen ions, ammonium ions can be secreted. So again, this would be some substance that didn't leave the blood here. It's still in the blood when we go from the efferent onto the peritubular capillaries, and therefore we want to get rid of it. It's waste. These are all waste things we don't want. In the descending limb, especially this thin segment, water. Water is what's reabsorbed. All right. Urea can be secreted here. In the ascending, it's these guys, sodium, potassium, chlorides. Not water. Right? Water does not follow here, and solutes don't follow here. So in the limbs of the loop, we uncouple or separate waters and solutes. Right? As we get into the distal convoluted tubule, we have still some more that we can reabsorb. Most of it is sodiums and chlorides. The chlorides follow the sodiums. Some bicarbonate, and of course water tends to follow. Right, but we have to be cautious here. Tends to follow. Water, if it's aldosterone, water will follow. All right, and then in the collecting duct, we get some secretion here in the distal convoluted tubule as well. Again, waste. So potassium's here. And this would be something that aldosterone would allow reabsorption of sodium and secretion of potassium. And then here in the collecting duct, this is a target for ADH. So a lot of water can, or not a lot, but the remaining water that's still in the filtrate can be reabsorbed here because of ADH. The remaining sodium that's here can be reabsorbed because of aldosterone. All right. So I call this whole process selective reclamation, right? And substances are being moved from the renal tubes into the interstitial fluid, so the fluid surrounding everything, all cells, and then into the capillaries. So reabsorption is ultimately from the renal tubule back to the blood. Okay. How will they be transported? Well, let's go back to those molecular transports. These go by active transport. They go by or co-transport, facilitated diffusion. Diffusion is probably not real high here. Mostly active or facilitated diffusion, so control transporters. There's a really good table on page 1228, and I say remember, most of the reabsorption is in the proximal. Right away, we want it back. And secretion, shown here, is done pretty much throughout. But secretion is going to be something that's a waste product. All right, so this is nice because, again, a nice table to look at what happened here. So we collectively have, about this many liters of fluid, mostly water, that come into the tubule, into the nephron and kidneys and nephron. We're going to take back 99% of this, really. Proteins, we don't want any in the urine. We've already said that. So some of these are filtered because they're small enough, and then they are reabsorbed, reclaimed. Chlorides, really most of it. Sodiums, right, most of it. Bicarbonate, most of it, but this will depend, right, on your pH of the blood. Glucose, oh yeah, all of it. Glucose shouldn't be in urine. Urea, well, that is a waste product, and we're going to get rid of some of it, though we do keep some and recycle it through here. Potassium, this can vary depending on your diet, and can vary with pathologies, but some of it is lost in the urine on a regular basis. Uric acid, some of it is lost, right, though a lot of it does stay in the kidneys. And creatinine, most of it, right, it's not really actively reabsorbed, though it can be secreted, right? This is a waste product. These are waste products, right? So I say up here, most calcium, sodium, glucose, and amino acids will be reabsorbed, right? And that's what we just talked about here. Potassium, ammonia, creatinine, and drugs will be secreted as waste. And then hydrogens will be to regulate acid-base balance. And that's what you looked at on this previous cartoon here. All right? So this is a really nice, here we are really focused in on a cell, right? And this would be the proximal convoluted, because here's those microvilli. And that's what I said. There's all these transporters here in this, we call this the apical or luminal side of the cell. And this, of course, is this is part of the tube. So the tube would completely be here. This is the filtrate in the tube, the filtrate that came from the capsule. And it's got all this stuff in it, and we want to start moving it back to, and this would be a peritubular capillary. Here's again the interstitial space. So I said the filtrate differs from the blood in the absence of cells and large proteins. So the filtrate here would have looked a lot like the blood that was in the glomerulus, but it would not have any cells, and it wouldn't have these large proteins like albumin, fibrinogen, and so forth. Okay? And now we're going to take and return a lot of this, but leaving the waste in here, though we can also, again, secrete. So here we're interested in the peritubular capillaries. We're done with the glomerulus. Glomerulus simply did filtration. The peritubulars have to be structured to allow reabsorption. All right? There's also a feature of the peritubular capillaries called the vasorecta, and this is going to help us when we really require more water being reabsorbed. All right? So I say here the movement is by osmolarity here, not pressure. So now we have to switch gears, right? We're not forcing it out because of hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. It's really concentrations. So concentration in here is kind of high because we've got all these large proteins still in here. So this osmotic pressure here is helping to pull this back. But really the reality is every single solute, as you see a number of them here, that moves will take water with it. So a lot of this movement is from the filtrate, right? So here's reabsorption from the filtrate into the cell and from the cell into the blood, all right? Sodium is very key to this movement. And again, it pretty much takes other things with it, negatively charged, and as well as some positive, and will then take water with it. There are a limit to the number of transporters, and so in a situation like a diabetic, that's why glucose stays in the filtrate, because there's only so many glucose transporters. So it's not that you can't move glucose, it's just that there's not enough, right, doors, if you will, in the cell membrane to allow all the glucose to come back. All right, so that is an important concept here. All right, slow, right? So we'll pick up in the next video more about reabsorption and secretion.